This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacy.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. This week, we present Risk Revolution, a monthly series intended to advance the maturity of risk management practices within the industry by covering topics that challenge quality professionals to continuously seek opportunities to improve and advance the ways in which they perceive and manage risk. This week, our series coordinators, Lori and Nuala, will engage their guest, Valerie Mulholland, in a lively discussion on a critical aspect of risk management, namely the skills and confidence necessary to make effective and timely risk-based decisions. Well, welcome to all three of you. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Stacey. It's absolutely great to be back again. And no doubt, like everyone else, we're all looking forward to a more hopeful and healthy 2021. As you said, this time on Risk Revolution, we're really getting to the nub of the issue with a focus on risk-based decisions. And we're excited to have Valerie join us to make the case for improved formality in QRM decision-making and even share her take on seeking the diamonds. So diamonds, what's not to like about that, ladies? Lori.
Yeah. So yes, thank you, Stacey. I'm excited to be back again as well. And I think one thing that we've really been focusing on a lot in our conversations is risk assessments. And typically we do cover that a lot, even in training, but we don't really get into the risk-based decision making sometimes in training. And in fact, often when I was a consultant, that wasn't a topic we discussed as much. It was more, how do I facilitate? How do I score? How do I define risk? So I'm excited to get into this topic today and tackle, how are we going to do this? How do we make risk-based decisions? Thank you.
Welcome to Valerie. Valerie, say hi.
Hi guys, Happy New Year and all the best for 2021, and thank you all for inviting me to join you today. I'm excited to share my thoughts on applying greater formality to risk-based decision making, because this is an issue, of course, you come across it a lot in your practical day-to-day work, but I did decide to get a little bit more formal about it, and I'm taking on some really structured research in this area. So I'm really excited to share this discussion with you.
Fantastic. So listen, let's get started. Lori, will you kick us off with an outline of what we're really referring to when we talk about risk-based decisions, and even where folks might even find an actual definition?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's good if we kind of start with ICH-Q9. So ICH-Q9 is kind of our document that we all go to in pharmaceuticals when we're thinking about quality risk management. But what's interesting is there really isn't a very clear decision or a description in terms of what risk-based decisions are defined as. And I think that's why many people struggle. It's often the question I get typically when I was consulting, especially, is how do I make this risk-based decision? What does that mean? And what's funny about it, especially as a consultant, is you go to several companies and they typically have in their SOP at the very end of it something to the effect of, and then make a risk-based decision. And no one sort of knows what to do with that. So let's kind of first step back and talk about a little bit what is in ICH-Q9 in terms of risk-based decision. And there are a few places where it's sort of quoted, and I kind of want to call those out. So effective quality risk management can facilitate better and more informed decisions. And I think that's really critical to kind of cling on to that phrase, because I think we get so wrapped up in the sort of tactical aspects of performing a risk assessment and whether something's red, yellow, or green that we sort of forget that this exercise is really providing us with information to help us make that decision. It's not, I always tell people, it's not a magical book that when I open the Excel spreadsheet, like lights are shining from the heavens and answers are provided to me. It's giving you information and some sort of standardized approach that's going to help me as a decision maker in making my decision, but I'm still going to have to make that decision, right? It's not going to sort of speak to me. And also, and within that phrase is that it's important to note that regulators then have more confidence when they're assessing that facility, when they're looking at that company, that, hey, they're paying attention, they're kind of collecting this information, they understand the risks that they're taking on. And then there's some other quotes too, that some of the tools of quality risk management that can enable more effective and consistent risk-based decisions, both by regulators and industry, regarding the quality of drug substances and drug products across the product life cycle. So again, these are tools that are providing us with information that are helping us to make those decisions across the life cycle of the product. But nowhere in ICH-Q9 does it say, this is how to make a risk-based decision. It's just ICH-Q9 isn't written that way. It's not going to provide those instructions. It's just giving us the freedom and the flexibility to use risk to inform us in our decision making. That being said, it does define a decision maker, though, right? So at least it gives us that role and what that person should be doing, and that person should have the competence and authority to make appropriate and timely quality risk management decisions. So I think what's imperative here is that whoever's using that information better be the appropriate sort of level and informed person and role within the organization to take that information to make a risk-based decision. So, and it does actually also define a risk control, its actions implementing the risk management decisions. So it does give us that kind of guidance in terms of, okay, what should we be doing with this decision? We should be mitigating that risk, right? But it doesn't tell us how to make those decisions. So I think today we're going to get into a little bit more dialogue around what kind of information is out there and what do we do with that information to make those decisions. Okay, so that's the formal ICH-Q9 stuff. Let's talk about risk-based decision in life. Okay, we are making these decisions every day. This morning when I logged onto this computer, I was having to make certain decisions about my computer was very slow, my Wi-Fi connection was not that great this morning. So I'm constantly kind of mitigating and thinking about how my day is going to go. And my goodness, we're in a pandemic. So we're making risk-based decisions now on top of typical normal risk-based decisions. Where are we going to go? Who are we going to interact with? Are we going to be exposed? So I think it's important to note that we've sort of made this risk-based decision phrase in ICH-Q9 seemingly like it's unattainable. What does this mean? It seems like such a difficult concept. But the truth is we've always been doing this as humans. We are wired to survive and we must make risk-based decisions on a daily basis. All we're saying now is use those risk assessments and that risk information that's provided to you in our pharmaceutical world to help you make those decisions. It's just a different data set, but you're still making the same types of decisions. You're trying to avoid and protect the patient and product quality. And so, Valerie, why don't you share a little bit more about your thoughts on informal and formal risk-based decision-making?
Thanks, Laurie. Actually, before I do, if I could just roll you back a minute to what you said there, it was very interesting about the definition of risk-based decision-making, or perhaps more importantly, the lack of it in the pharmaceutical world. And I think that's one of the first and clear challenges. We have no consensus of what that means. And it means different things to different people within our industry and even further afield. I mean, if you're in the military, a risk-based decision might mean, you know, how much would you or how far would you risk your team or your crew to arrive at an objective? If you were in finance, it's how much money you would risk, perhaps for some payday, you know. So, it is very, very different. And I don't think their definitions of risk fit our paradigm. So I was actually looking around for a definition that might suit our industry a little better. And I think I found a contender actually in ISO 31010, the 2019 standard. This is part of the 31000 series, although I think there are only 2 in the series. But these are the enterprise risk management standards issued by the ISO. And the 3110 is more about the risk management process, the risk assessment techniques. It's quite like our ICHQ9, actually. And buried in there is a little attempt at defining what they mean about decisions in that standard. And they have said that when they're talking about decisions, they're talking about two types of decisions. One is decisions about the significance of risk. So perhaps they're the types of decisions we make within quality risk management. For example, when we're deciding what tool to use or what risk ranking approach to take or how to rank a risk or whether that's acceptable or not. All those decisions within that process. I think that's one category they've described. And the second type of decision they have said is the decisions that involve comparing options when there's some level of uncertainty. And of course, I guess these are the decisions we would use QRM for. So, or the decisions we need QRM to inform. So, I think that's kind of a neat definition. You have the two types there, the ones within QRM and the ones that QRM is enabling, if you like. I think, too, it's worth mentioning, Laurie, that ICH, as we know, have established a working group to revise ICHQ9, and they published a concept paper, and that paper defines 4 areas with improvement with respect to the current application of QRM. And it's interesting, I mean, three of those 4 nearly touch on what we're talking about today. One is the decisions within QRM and the subjectivity that might be in those decisions. So the concept paper talks to subjectivity within quality risk management, and I guess where is the subjectivity? It's in those little decisions we make without maybe the objective evidence. It talks to formality, which is what we're talking about now, and it talks to a lack of clarity in what a risk-based decision is. So, I think we're really touching a ground here that is recognised as being in the need of more thought, if you like. But to return to what you asked me in the first place, Laurie, I'll make a long answer even longer, leave it to an Irish woman. To your formal and informal question, it's so long ago I've nearly forgotten. When I talk about the need to embrace more formality in our risk-based decision making, of course, I'm not referring to every decision in the operation. That's just, too big a scope and too big an exercise. And to be honest, in my recent work, I've been focusing on the significant decisions that you make within the PQS, within the pharmaceutical quality system, that you're relying on QRM to enable. And I suppose we're particularly talking about here, the elements identified in ICHQ10. The change control, the CAPA, the management review, the treble PQM. I don't know what other people call that acronym, but the process, performance, and product quality monitoring element, And again, I wouldn't be arguing for formality in every decision within those elements, but formal tools could be helpful with the significant ones. And I suppose why? Well, there's many reasons, but just to pick a few, I think transparency is very important. If you have a formal process, it does it does give a degree of transparency about how a decision was made. Like researchers in this area of decision quality and decision analysis, they've been nearly unanimous in pointing out that you can't measure the quality of a decision by the outcome. I mean, you can have, very considered and careful decisions made and unexpected or poor outcomes. I think we've seen that even with the COVID decision-making processes. People are reviewing and very carefully modelling and very carefully reviewing data to make public health recommendations, which, the data would predict should work, and then the outcome. It doesn't mean the decision was poor. It just means that was the information that was available at the time. time. The inverse is true as well. You can have, very good, very, very good decisions made by, the lucky. So outcomes are not necessarily a good measure. And we do hear our regulators pointing out to us that, since QRM was introduced, they haven't particularly seen a decline in market defects with products or, recalls being less or even issues with supply reducing. So, that would question whether it is the best measure. But process might be able to inform us, a decision audit trail, if you like. That does give a basis to evaluate decision making and then, by inference, to truly evaluate the value of QRM, particularly when uncertainty is a factor as well, which of course is another reason why one might introduce formality. And I just think I'll just squeeze in a third one, if I may, which is complexity. I think modern management systems, tend to reduce information to, a PowerPoint slide or a very one-dimensional picture of a trend or a graph or a chart. And, this is an excellent way of communicating information and even communicating risk and communicating, where we are. But it's a very reductive basis for decision making. And, we work in very complex, very data-rich environments, where information should be connected. We should understand the relative meaning of data. And that can be lost when we just chart it out in very simple diagrams, if we have a PQS that's really, overseeing our process and our product quality in a truly sophisticated, data-rich manner. If there's an issue, we should be getting signals all over the place, right? That's what I would think. So formal tools might cause us to look a bit more closely at and harder at our data and maybe force us to make more connections between it as well. So,
Very good. Valerie, I love what you're saying there about the evaluation and evaluation based on the process rather than the outcomes, because as you quite clearly stated, the outcomes aren't necessarily a good indicator or a leading indicator, but it certainly can help to strengthen the process. If we're looking at, some of the things that Laurie mentioned from Q9, they're looking for timely, well-informed decisions taken by, the appropriate level. Well, there's 3 really simple criteria that you could establish, some very simple metrics around the decision-making process. Was it timely? Did we get, did we have decision velocity or did we end up in a kind of a lockdown loop? Who was involved in making the decision and were they the right people? And perhaps if we didn't necessarily get the right outcomes, would we review who was on that team the next time round? And definitely, were we well informed? Did we have enough data? And did they seek the data or even use the data in informing that decision? Was there clear rationale between what they observed in the data and what, the path that they took? And these are really simple things that can allow us to look at the effectiveness of the decision making with a continuous improvement hat on, slant too. Without, and of course, you can still take in, were we lucky, as you mentioned, or, did we hit the nail on the head? And that's still important to understand, but I think it's really good to have that contextual evaluation. Metrics have been, in de rigueur in the industry now in recent years. But again, as I often say about metrics, we can be measuring the wrong things and it drives the wrong outcomes and definitely drives the wrong behaviors. But if we can set some smart measures and evaluation review processes in place, we can drive the right behaviors. And the right behaviors, we know, is what will drive the right outcomes. That will definitely have an influence in terms of driving the right outcomes. But
absolutely,
coming back to your recent article, we both loved it. Both Laurie and I loved your article in Level 3. We've got a link to it. We'll talk about that in the takeaways later on. And you titled your article "Seeking the Diamonds," and that term really resonated with me. I'm going to steal it quite shamelessly, because it's an opportunity for us to really put some emphasis in our traditional risk management processes around those diamonds, around the decision-making points that we encounter. So perhaps you can share with us how you came to employ that term.
Absolutely, Nuala, thanks. Well, it kind of relates to what I was saying there about straw diagrams. So as I was doing my research, and I went back a long way, I went back to 1921, a decade or a century, and I came across a presentation given to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers way back then. And it was given by a husband and wife team, actually, Frank and Lillian Galbraith. And they presented to this society the first structured method for documenting process flows. And they were both industrial engineers. They were pioneers, really, in the area of time and motion studies, which would be the forerunner, I guess, today of standardized work practices. They're kind of more or less accredited with the process flow concept. And to this day, we draw process flows, in many industries to kind of detail and analyze and visualize the key steps in a process. And there are some variations in notation across industries, but, most commonly a task is represented by a rectangular box and a decision is a diamond. So the diamonds are the points in the process where there's more than one option available, there's more than one way to go, and a decision is required. So that's where the reference to the diamonds came from. And interestingly enough, even though ICHQ9 includes that very iconic flow diagram that we're all very familiar with about the risk management process, I suppose kind of notable is the lack of decision nodes in there, the lack of diamonds. And in fact, the text of the document pointed out that this was because they didn't conclude them deliberately, because decisions could occur anywhere in that process. So, that sort of got me thinking, well, where are those diamonds in that process, and where are the significant diamonds in that process? And of course, if you move on to ICHQ10, QRM should be informing the major decisions that are made in the elements it calls out. So where are those diamonds? So I call the paper Seeking the Diamonds. Where are the big questions? Where are the big issues where formality might help?
Well, we loved it, and I'm certainly going to be mining for the diamonds in my risk management situations going forward, because I just think it's a lovely way to think about it, and bring us to that point where in the process where we need to choose a path forward. So linking back then, Laurie, to your earlier reference in the decision makers that is defined in Q9, and indeed the way it's positioned in Q9 indicates that it's a person or a group of people. But as we know now, as we advance with Industry 4.0 or Pharma 4.0, depending on what side of the fence you come from, and with all the technology advances we're seeing a much greater embrace of data-driven decision support tools in daily use in our industry. Data analytics, signal-rich PQS databases, our continued process verification programs, whether that's data historians, maybe applying SPC or trend analysis packages. So what are your thoughts on these technologies and their influence in terms of the decision-making process?
Yeah, so I've sort of been thinking about this question just because there's various levels of maturity across pharmaceuticals for these new technologies too, right? In some places, we still very much have a very manual operation, and in some cases, a highly sophisticated operation. And so, of course, you're asking more about these more advanced technologies. And it's interesting. I'm curious to see, I think maybe even hopefully the listeners would have thoughts on this as well. I'm curious to see sometimes how much humans have trust and faith in those signals and in those technologies. Sometimes I notice that when we put those things in place, we're very excited about them, and we're it's quite the advancement. And then I notice that we sort of don't have faith and trust in that to manage our risks, if you will, right? And we second guess that system. And one thing that kind of came to mind when I think of that was I was recently watching this documentary on the Boeing 737 MAX and kind of what happened there. In terms of it had this, this sensor right on the nose of the plane, and that sensor's purpose and job was to sort of tell, the cockpit, right, where that plane was sort of angled up or down, right. In the case of those accidents during the investigation, it was determined that there was an automated pilot system that was actually designed then to compensate based on what that sensor was telling the cockpit. What wasn't told to the pilot, though, was that the system was actually capable of doing that. And so what happened in those first few accidents was the pilot was actually trying to take control of the plane based on the information that was fed to the cockpit, and that then resulted in the accident because sort of the pilot was fighting with this automated system, right, that was designed to manage that. But upon further investigation, it was even determined that the sensor wasn't even designed correctly, or I think installed correctly on the front of the plane. So the sensor was actually feeding incorrect information to the automated pilot system, which then resulted, of course, the pilot not knowing that this was actually happening, then resulted in this plane trying to compensate constantly, pilot fighting that. Plane eventually took a nosedive, and of course there was awful accidents that occurred from that and fatalities. And so I kind of went back to that when I was thinking about automated systems, and it's like, first of all, I guess first and foremost, those automated systems have to be installed and designed correctly by a human. So we still have the human interaction piece, but it's up front in that design system. The human then has to have trust and faith that the system is able to make that design or that decision correctly, and then be able to compensate and make whatever correction it's supposed to do to mitigate that risk, right? So there's a lot of still human interaction that's happening, even though we're living in this sort of automated big data kind of world, right? So there's a part of me that hasn't really made a decision on how I think that's going to play out. And having come from a facility that was fairly advanced and automated, it was oftentimes challenging because the original coding was sometimes incorrect. And then, a series of things have occurred and a series of lots have been produced. And we're all having faith in the system, right? It's automated and it's mitigating risk. It's making decisions based on data coming in, and it's managing risk. And no one knows that anything is happening because something was upfront incorrectly installed, right, and feeding misinformation all along the line. So I have a bit of a challenge and a debate in my mind around where I think we're going to go in terms of Industry 4.0 and kind of how, data, how these AI systems and things may be managing data for us and making risk-based decisions. So you can see, even as I'm talking, I'm conflicted in how I feel about it. But that being said, I also think it offers great opportunity. Right? Because imagine if we're being fed information, data, that's actually able to predict, right, that a risk could occur. And it's actually almost doing a real-time risk assessment, right? And building data to tell us, hey, we've run 10 batches of this. We think this is going to be the next issue. I mean, how amazing is that? So there's this other side of me that's pretty excited about those advancements and thinking about what that data can tell us. And imagine being fed real-time constant information that possibly is going to help me manage data down the road, and it's not me sitting in a conference room with 10 other people doing an FMEA, right? It's a whole new world, right, of managing risk. So there's a little bit of excitement there in terms of these new technologies, and in some cases already installed technologies where these decision makers, if you will, are automated systems, right, that are doing this for us. There's that other side of me that's like, did everything get installed correctly? Are people checking this? Do we still need the human intervention somewhere? That's the part I'm sort of struggling with. The second piece of that I was kind of jotting down in my mind as you were talking, Nuala, and thinking through, is we're going to have to make decisions a lot faster now than I think we're used to making in the past. And let's use even our current situation with the COVID-19 vaccine. Of course, I don't work at a facility that manufactures vaccines, but all I can think about is, wow, that lot release process must be very streamlined, very quick, rapid, intake of information, methods that are run very quickly in QC analytics probably, and a lot disposition group that's probably very well, a well-run machine, if you will, and knows what information they need to take in and how quick they need to make those decisions. The world is depending on them, right? So when I thought about that, I had a whole newfound respect for that group of people, probably, and what they're going through and how quickly they're having to make risk-based decisions in this process. The second piece of technology I was thinking about too was cell therapies and how quickly those risk-based decisions must be made. Typically, these patients' cells are harvested, they go through a manufacturing process that may take several weeks, and then those cells are taken back to that exact patient, a very personalized healthcare process of which there is just no time to wait for a 30-day investigation or a 45-day supplier discussion. So those types of risk-based decisions must be very quick, rapid. We must be able to assess that in a more streamlined approach than our structured FMEA tools. That being said, those structured FMEA tools have a place early on in the design of that process that will then help inform us to make those quicker decisions. So those are kind of the thoughts that we're going through. I'm still a little bit on the fence about how I feel about our future technologies and that big data kind of world, but I think there's some great opportunity there.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because, as an industry, obviously we're being encouraged to innovate with all these new technologies and techniques in terms of how we do our work and how we release our materials. But we're still attempting to shoehorn some of that into a more kind of rule-based regulation and compliance approaches, which are just not nimble or agile enough to apply to this new, cell and gene therapy paradigm that you're talking about. Not only do we need to be agile in terms of velocity of our decisions, but we also may be dealing with a very small patient cohort, so we don't have a huge amount of data yet. For some of these orphan drugs, It's not like you're going to have that. You're going to need the data scientists. You definitely need the people there with the knowledge. And we've talked before, and maybe we'll come back to that link between knowledge and risk management about, as we increase our knowledge about the process, we reduce our risk. And when we have very little knowledge about a process, it automatically increases.
And I think that, Valerie, I like that you addressed that point where we do have to change our decisions sometimes. And I think that's very frustrating to the general public when they see, today it's this and now tomorrow it's that. What's Big Pharma going to say next? And it's exactly what you said, Nuala. We're constantly getting information and we're constantly thinking about getting things to the patient because we care so much about getting those therapeutics quickly to treat those patients that sometimes we're having to make decisions on, like you said, possibly a very small cohort of patients. And then maybe time goes by, now we know this. Okay, now let's instruct the patient to use the device in this manner. That makes it safer or that makes it quicker. It doesn't mean that we're making shoot from the hip sort of decisions just to get through. It just means sometimes we only have so much information, and that's science, right? Science, you learn more as you go further along in the process, and you have to adapt to that and change those decisions sometimes.
Yeah, but it has, even though it's been a bit clunky for several years trying to move some of these new technologies with that kind of traditional rule-based compliance approaches and rule-based regulation. But it has been really heartwarming and awe-inspiring, as you mentioned, throughout the pandemic, because the whole community, both the regulators and the manufacturers, the drug discovery, the clinical trials community, and of course the clinicians as well who've engaged. It's been really, really awe-inspiring to see the speed at which the whole community worked together to address the challenge, the global challenge around this vaccines race. And we still have several furlongs to go to get across the finish line. But it does bring us nicely to that topic of decision velocity. And as you mentioned, these new arm-to-arm technologies, the supply chains are measured in hours sometimes rather than weeks and months. And being able to make those well-informed and effective decisions in a timely manner, is increasingly becoming a critical factor and a critical skill that we need to develop within our industry. So Valerie, back to yourself then. What are your thoughts on how these more formal processes that you're investigating can help enhance this decision velocity?
Yeah, I mean, I think decision velocity for sure is going to get more and more pressurized, if you like. You've given some great examples there. Another one that pops into my head at a practical level, in most current environments is the investigation of complaint timelines, which, in average, I think in most operations is running about 30 days, which seems an extraordinary amount of time to review your data to see what happened and what might have happened. So, I think velocity is going to become a crunch issue in coming times. But, while having a process and a structure and a level of formality should ultimately speed up matters, I think it'd be naive to think it would do so immediately. I mean, we saw in other aspects of QRM when root cause analysis was formalized, when risk assessment was formalized, it slowed things down initially while people, got more familiar with the process and the tools and learned to use them. But we got better and we learned to see the value in them. And I think there's value there for my diamonds as well, the formal decision making, because, we make many of our key decisions with some element of uncertainty. My own practical experience is mainly in manufacturing operations. And again, when you look at that process flow diagram of the product life cycle, starting in process development through to commercial manufacturing and those little 5 patches out to discontinuation, it looks very linear on paper, but it seldom is that consecutive in the real world. An example of that, it would be, when you're establishing a new operation, quite early in the process, commitments have to be made to commission or purchase equipment, and that equipment has to be specified. And sometimes that's done concurrently with process and test development. And, you can be making these decisions on somewhat sketchy or evolving information, and there can be significant uncertainty around some or all of those decisions. And that type of decision, purchasing reactors or a significant piece of equipment, that's what I call in the paper an irrevocable decision. In other words, there's no real going back from it. It's a big commitment, and that's not a term I invented, by the way. That is in the decision kind of research. But when you make a kind of a decision like that, and you have a lot of uncertainty, taking a formal process, there's a lot of value in understanding what I'm calling the carrot of the diamond. How reliable is the information you have? What assumptions are you making because you don't have hardcore information? Where the risks lie? And ultimately what you need to monitor to ensure that your decision is not incorrect. So velocity is I think going to be an increasing pressure. So in parallel with that, I think we need to develop the processes to make sure that our decisions are well structured and considered. Not to overplay the diamond allegory again, although I'm doing it to death here. It is what most engagement rings are made of. So what do they say about marriage? Marry in haste and repent at leisure. And I think some decisions we might make, process might trump speed, because if the outcome is suboptimal, then, at least having applied a rigor to it, as you said earlier, Nuala, there might be lessons learned from that, So, if you don't mind me rattling on for another minute, it is also this idea of we can look back and see how was that decision made. If you had the same information, if you were to whisk yourself back, look at the same information, would you make the same decision? I mean, in a way, that's the kind of process or review we undergo in audit. And I think it might be worth just, opening up the concept of risk-based regulation as well, because I'm not sure we've had enough discussion around that. The way we are regulated has changed considerably in the last decade. It's gone from a very compliance-based process to a risk-based process. And that changes the way issues and the decisions we make on issues are reviewed or will be reviewed in audit. And I was reading some very interesting work in this area from a gentleman called Professor Malcolm Sparrow. And he's in the practice of public management in Harvard's JFK School of Government. So his students are usually government agencies, and he talks about regulation design. Because of COVID, his government, he's an international student, they can't meet him. So he just published a book before Christmas, kind of with his lecture series. He publishes lecture series, and it's a really interesting read. In the book he acknowledged that, many government agencies have changed their approach to risk-based regulation. They have changed their, regulations to accommodate that. They've changed their own structures. They've changed the way they resource their audits and how they allocate and prioritize based on that paradigm. But he also kind of raises the question that there remains kind of a lack of clarity of how that works out operationally on the ground when these folks are auditing operations. And I think that is a good question for ourselves, our industry, and the way we're regulated. I do think we're unclear still how to present QRM effectively and what's expected of it.
Yeah, I love that concept of risk-based regulation. I mean, we've seen more and more about risk-based inspection planning coming in, and we know of the PICS work in that area, and other agencies all have their own algorithms. But in terms of understanding how we apply that to the regulations themselves, it's a concept, and maybe it sounds like another podcast topic for us to look into at some stage. Laura,
I just wrote it down.
watch this space for sure. Absolutely love it. Laurie, would you like to close us out?
Oh, yes. So I just wanted to add I just wanted to actually sort of second what you said too, Valerie, that I think there's going to be a little bit more challenge too for regulators, because I think as we delve into these rare diseases and other spaces that are newer and have different types of technology, how about, younger patients, right? In gene therapy, we're talking about now very young children. That's typically not a common patient that's in clinical trials and stuff. So there's going to be new risk there. Not that there aren't children in trials, but I mean, I think we're going to see a little bit more of that, right? The speed at which we've seen the vaccine approval, that's going to change our world, I think, in the future. I think the public is going to go, well, wait a second, you approved, this vaccine in 10 months. How come my daughter can't get this drug for her treatment? Why is she still waiting? So I think there's going to be a whole new world with risk-based regulation, So I look forward to that topic. Any other last thoughts from anyone before we close out today?
Something occurred to me just as Valerie was talking about that last point around, particularly around, the velocity of, in complaint investigations taking 30 days. One of the other things that our systems, our formal pharmaceutical quality systems, tends to lead us down the path of making these individual decisions to support individual events. The way our systems log each complaint or each deviation or each investigation, we've got a unique number and we have to close it out. And for audit purposes, we must have all the T's crossed and I's dotted and right color pen, etc. But actually, there's some lovely work that has been done, not so much in our industry, around, a group theory and clustering, and it could become part of our risk review processes, so that we start to look at at events in groups or clusters. And one of the quotes, and I can't remember where I got this from, but I know I've used it before, is that, if we try and control a swarm of locusts, one locust at a time, which is how we handle our deviations or our investigations, we're never going to win. That's not something. But if we can sit down and look at the environmental conditions that create a swarm, that can create that context where a swarm can occur, and you can attack those root causes, to those environmental conditions, then you have a much better chance of not being overrun, and all of your crops being overrun each time. So I think as part of the risk review, I would love if this formalization of the risk decision, risk-based decisions, becomes part of something that we can do, not as an individual event where we've got a timeline, do we have to close this investigation out, but in that kind of clustering and group theory to see, are there underpinning behaviors that we can modify, that we can strengthen our decision outcomes. So that's just something that occurred to me. But I've loved this. I'm loving all of this, as well as the diamonds.
Valerie. I couldn't agree with you more, Nuala, there, to be honest. But as a final word, to get back to my pet subject of formalizing risk-based decisions, I was looking at NASA. They have quite a sensible mantra. They do, by the way, have criteria for identifying which and what decisions should be formally done. And in the paper you're going to give a link to, I have taken those and tried to say, well, how would that fit in a PQS system? But they do have a quick rule of thumb as well, which is, when they look at a decision that has to be made, whether or not to be formal or informal, they say, is there value in reducing the uncertainty here? Which, in other words, can we afford to get it wrong? And I think that is a good rule of thumb and perhaps a good parting thought.
I love it. Yeah, thanks, Valerie.
That's great.
Fantastic.
So, Stacey, I think we're back to you.
Yeah. And I just want to thank all three of you for this really thought-provoking discussion. Certainly several great points for our listeners to consider today. And Nuala, I'm hoping you can wrap us up by recapping for us today's key takeaways.
Yeah, so, we've had lots of great discussion, as you mentioned, but obviously a lot of it focused around Valerie's recent Level 3 article, which we're going to provide the link to. So certainly we love having takeaways for our listeners, so we'll provide the link to that. There's also an article that Laurie wrote for you guys in JVT around leadership and decision making. So we think that's valuable, because that link to leadership, we didn't quite get into that today, but it's a key aspect of this appropriate decision maker. So those two links are definitely there, and we always like to have a little gift for our listeners. So, yes. But come back to us next month for our next topic.
Fantastic! Thank you so much. Thank you. As our risk revolution leaders, we welcome Laurie and Nuala every month. They always bring great insights. And thankfully for me, they always find great guests too. So thank you, Valerie, for taking some time to share your expertise with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And last but certainly not least, we are so grateful to you, our valued listeners, and thank you for listening to us each week. If you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice, and don't forget to share it with your colleagues, your friends, and of course, your online networks. If you have topic requests, questions based on these conversations, or guest suggestions, we'd definitely love to hear from you on that. You can find us on LinkedIn or through our website. And for today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, make it a great week.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.